Okay, this is summary review number 3, and this is dealing with a method of factoring we call least powers. This comes in real handy when we're talking about situations involving what we call the product rule and the quotient rule when we're doing derivatives. And that may not be that meaningful to you now, but eventually it will have a little bit more meaning to you. So here's number 1. And what we want to do is we want to factor. I'll cover this up so I can kind of focus on what we're dealing with. I hope you can see this. I think you can zoom in if there's an issue. And we have these two terms. And we know we have the same base, so we have a common factor that we can factor out. Now, you're not used to seeing these fractional exponents, so that's where it gets to be a little tricky. But what we do is we have a method called least powers where you factor out the least power. Well, we have 3/2 and 1/2, so 1/2 is smaller than 3/2. So that's what I factor out. So I'm going to factor out x to the 1/2. Now remember, when you're factoring out, or you're actually dividing. We just don't usually think of it like that, but that's actually what you're doing. And remember, when we divide bases with exponents, what we do is when we divide, we subtract the exponents. Okay, this is a rule of exponents. So basically, I'm going to have 3/2 minus 1/2 because I'm going to be factoring that out. So this is going to be x to the 3/2 minus 1/2, which is like dividing x to the 3/2 by x to the 1/2. Or we're dividing it out. And then the same thing, I have minus x to the 1/2, and then I'll be subtracting the 1/2. So in these problems, I try to put the subtraction in red, and then the number that or the exponent that I'm subtracting in green. So hopefully it helps you see what's going on. I try to be consistent with that on all these problems, so hopefully that'll help. Okay, this is what we got so far. Now we can simplify this. 3/2 minus 1/2 is 2/2. Okay, and then 1/2 minus 1/2 is 0. Now anything to the 0 power is just 1. So this ends up being x to the 1/2, and then 2/2 is just 1, so that's just going to be x to the first power, or x minus x to the 0, which is 1, and that's pretty much done. Okay, let's take a look at number 2. And they can get a little more complicated as we go along, so try to just write these out, take a look at them. I think the issue that some students have is they try to skip too many steps and they get fouled up on their signs, their SIGNs, so you have to be careful. Okay, so I got x to the 3/2 minus x to the 1/4. Well, 3/2 is bigger than 1, 1/4 is smaller than 1, so 1/4 is the least power, so that's what I'm going to factor out. Now, since I'm going to be subtracting the exponents, I would want this in fourths. So 3/2 is the same thing as 6/4, so I wrote that as x to the 6/4 minus, and then I'm going to factor out the 1/4, so I'm or x to the 1/4, so I'm going to divide by x to the 1/4, which means I'm going to subtract the exponents. Minus, and this is going to be x to the 1/4 minus 1/4. Okay, well, 6/4 minus 1/4 is 5/4. 1/4 minus 1/4 is 0. Okay, and then x to the 0 is just 1. So that's all we have to do with that one. So take a look at this, and again, I know lots of times you guys don't want to write down all the little steps, and that's where you'll get fouled up. So you want to be careful. The more steps you write, the safer you are, the less chance you are of making an error, because you're going to see a little bit more of what you're doing. Okay, number 3. And again, I might have overdone some of these steps, but with me it's always better safe than sorry. Okay, now in these two terms I have a common factor 4, so I'm going to factor that out, and I'll show you that we actually divide it out. And I've got 2 powers here, and my least power is obviously negative 2/3. That's to the left of 1/3, so that's the least power. So I'm going to factor out a 4 and a negative 2/3. So I designated the 4 in orange and the negative 2/3 in green. So when I'm factoring out the 4, I'm really just dividing, so I just wrote it out so you can see it. Don't usually just do this in your head, but this is actually what you're doing. So this is 4x to the negative 2/3 divided by 4. I mean, factoring out that 4, if you multiply this, say they would cancel. And then minus, and then a negative 2/3. Now the negative sign here is the division part, and the negative 2/3 was that was my least power. So I've got double negatives, and that's what's going to happen a lot with these. So minus negative 2/3, and then I got 8 divided by 4, x to the 1/3 minus, again, negative 2/3. So I got double negatives. So I put down an extra step here to show you what's going on. Now this just becomes 4 times x to the negative 2/3. 4 over 4 is 1. And then the negative times a negative is a positive. And again, a negative times a negative is a positive. 4 goes into 8 twice. So if I simplify this, negative 2/3 plus 2/3 is just 0. And 1/3 plus 2/3 is 3/3. All right? And then the final step, 3/3 is 1, so I just have x to the first power, or x, so this is 2x. And x to the 0 is 1, so I've got 1 plus 2x. I've got 4, and all I did was take the x to the negative 2/3 and put that on the bottom so we'd have a positive exponent, because lots of times we like that positive exponent in the denominator rather than a negative exponent in the numerator. And that's what you have. So again, take a look at these. It's the same process. Just be careful. Again, write down your steps and you won't make mistakes. Okay, and number 4. So again, if we look at our two terms here, this is number 4. I've got 12 and 6. So 6 is a common factor for 12 and 6. And then my least power would be negative 3/4 because this is positive, so that's obviously least. So I'm going to factor out 6 because that goes into both numbers, and x to the negative 3/4. And then I wrote this out again to show you the steps. So this is 12 divided by 6 because I'm factoring out the 6. X to the negative 3/4. That was this. That's why it's in black. Minus negative 3/4. And then this term, 6 divided by 6, x to the 1/4 minus negative 3/4. A negative times a negative is a positive. Okay, so this just becomes 6, and I just brought this down. 6 goes into 12 twice, negative 3/4 plus 3/4, and then 6 goes into 6 once, 1/4 plus 3/4. Now this is just 0. So I have 2 times x to the 0 plus x, and 1/4 plus 3/4 is 4/4. So x to the 4/4, which is just 1. So I end up, and I wrote a little more steps on this one that maybe I had to. I can put the negative 3/4 in the bottom and make it positive. And 4 over 4 is 1. So put a little extra step in there. And then x to the 0 is just 1. So I've got 2 times 1 is 2. Plus x to the first is x. A 6 in front. And the x to the 3/4 in the bottom. So it's not hard if you do all the steps and you're careful. Like again, the problem will be if you try to skip steps. So be careful on this.